Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of our forum on business and human rights. I'm very happy to welcome you here in the room, but also a very warm welcome to our virtual participants who are online with us today. My name is Geertre Lano. I work for the International Organization for Migration. I'm the Senior Regional Specialist for Labor Mobility and Social Inclusion based here at the IOM Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. And I'll be the moderator of our first session today, which is looking at forced displacement, human rights, and the role that businesses can play in that. Let me first of all give you maybe a quick overview of the situation that we have in the region today. Actually, IOM just released its new Asia Pacific Migration Data Report, which also gives a sense of what's happening in the region in terms of migration and forced displacement. And actually, we see a very high number of forced displacement. Asia Pacific hosts some of the countries of the highest number of displaced persons. At this point, we see about 9.5 million people from Asia Pacific countries who've been forcibly displaced due to conflict. On top of that, also many people are forcibly displaced due to disasters, natural disasters. Over half of the number of new disaster-included displacements worldwide are actually from Asia and the Pacific. And we also estimate that, for example, climate change will have a very high impact on displacement also in the future in Asia and the Pacific. So it's a right moment for us to reflect on, what is the situation displaced persons faced? And with displaced persons, we can think of refugees, but also internally displaced persons who are displaced because of natural disasters, for example, or even climate change. And what we see is that many of these people actually find it very difficult to rebuild their lives, to access, employment or other livelihood opportunities, to even, have their right to work respected. So this is the topic of our session today, to look together with key stakeholders, whether from business, whether from UN, international organizations, whether from civil society or employers, on what can we do to facilitate access to employment, to facilitate decent work for migrants and displaced persons. There's a lot of good initiatives, and I'm sure my colleagues here at the panel will share some of the good practice. But unfortunately, also there's a lot more that needs to be done. We see that if there's no effort made to ensure that migrants and displaced persons in specific can access regular labor migration pathways, for example, that they can have the right to work. Eventually, their only option is, either, employment in the informal sector, very limited livelihoods opportunities, often also, exposure to exploitative working conditions. So we thought, let's discuss this today and let's see what the private sector, what the UN, what NGOs, what employers can do to support migrants and displaced persons in accessing regular labor migration opportunities, in accessing decent work as a pathway to a durable solution. Now, as IOM, we've been engaging on this topic for a while, together with UNHCR and Talent Beyond Boundaries. We're actually part of the Global Task Force on Refugee Labor Mobility, and that's a global task force that is looking at how can we enhance access to decent work pathways for refugees through labor migration opportunities. Of course, we're also working with the private sector more broadly. One of our partners is here. We're all partners, but I was actually looking for Sung In from Adidas, because Adidas is one of the businesses that has engaged with IOM in terms of enhancing protection of migrant workers and displaced persons who are working in Adidas supply chains. So this is another practice that will be shared in today's panel. So let me perhaps introduce now the panel to you. We have with us 4 panelists from very diverse backgrounds, representing very diverse stakeholders. I'll start on my right with Damla Buyuktaski, right, Damla? So Damla is working from UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, as a Senior Regional Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Officer for Asia and the Pacific. And she oversees everything linked to employment, entrepreneurship, skills building, training for labor market integration of refugees, with, of course, the objective to ensure their self-reliance. And I believe she covers more than 40 countries in this region.
43.
43, okay, wow, impressive. So welcome, Damla. Then we have with us also Sung-In Marshall from Adidas. And Sung-In is a senior manager for human rights and development partnerships with Adidas based in Hong Kong. And she manages projects and initiatives related to addressing modern slavery and forced labor risks in the supply chains, also strategic partnerships on key social and labor issue areas. And she has been working closely with IOM in terms of promoting responsible recruitment practices within Adidas and their suppliers. Then let me move to the other side of the table. We have Mr. Farouk Ahmed of the Bangladesh Employers Federation, representing the employers today. Farouk is the Secretary General of the Bangladesh Employers Federation since 2009, and he has been actively involved in reviewing labor laws, labor rules, labor policy, creating awareness on responsible business conduct in his country, and he's also an employer member in the ILO governing body. And then finally, next to me, Rachel Beck, and Rachel Beck is representing Talent Beyond Boundaries. Now, Talent Beyond Boundaries is an NGO that has been very actively engaged in promoting labor mobility pathways for refugees or for displaced persons. She will tell us more about that. She's the Global Partnerships Director at Talent Beyond Boundaries, and basically, supporting labor mobility programs for refugees around the world. So welcome to all the panelists. As you see, we'll hear from very different perspectives, from business, from UN, from NGOs, from employers. So really looking forward to the discussion. And we will focus on 3 questions today. The first one is, what are the barriers and challenges that displaced persons face to participate in formal labor markets? Secondly, what initiatives could be created to provide fair, equal, and decent work for displaced persons and migrants? And finally, how can global businesses promote integration and protection of displaced persons and migrants more broadly in international supply chains? So these are the questions we hope to answer with the panel, but also with you, the participants in the room. We hope to hear from you. We hope to hear your comments, your experiences, your suggestions or recommendations, and we'll definitely dedicate time for that in today's session. Now, Rachel, I would like to start with you, actually, because Talent Beyond Boundaries is very active in engaging businesses and governments in creating safe and legal pathways to enable displaced persons to move for work, to resume their careers, and to rebuild their lives. Now, I was wondering, from your experience on the ground, what are some of the barriers or challenges displaced persons face to participate in the labor markets? Why is it an issue in the first place?
Yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. Great question. I think the answer for us lies in 2 broad categories, and the first one would primarily be practical. So we all know that when people are displaced, especially across international boundaries, they often lose the right to work legally. They don't have the right paperwork to do so in the country where they've arrived. But that problem persists even if they try to move to a different country, and in some cases it actually becomes much worse. So on the face of it, it seems that anybody can apply for a job anywhere. In reality, that's not the case. If you're a displaced person applying for a job in the US or Mexico or anywhere else in the world, you face a very documentary process. You need a passport, you need to be able to pass a police check in your country of origin, you need a lot of paperwork, transcripts, things like this. So there are a lot of practical considerations, both at the destination end and also at the source side, we might say. You might not feel safe enough to travel to that passport appointment. You might not have the money for an English test if you need to pass one for a visa program. as many do require. So these are all very practical considerations, and Talent Beyond Boundaries, or TBB, focuses very much on alleviating those issues and finding solutions. But the other issue is really more conceptual, and I think that's perhaps the one that's more interesting to consider here today with you. And that is about the narrative around displaced people. So, as many of us probably have seen, that narrative often doesn't acknowledge the skills, the capacities, the resilience that displaced people already have. There's a lot of emphasis on vulnerability. There's a lot of emphasis on retraining, providing additional support, all of which is important. But it doesn't recognize what displaced people have already built up over time. And so TBB is really working with employers to recognize this untapped talent pool, with governments to recognize the assets that displaced people can be, and to help everybody understand that there are additional options on the table. Those are the two broad categories I would highlight.
Thank you, Rachel, and very good. You also highlighted the fact that displaced people also bring talent. They have skills, and we should look at that element rather than focusing on the vulnerability alone. So thank you for that. Let me now turn to you, Damla, because as UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, you're of course mandated to provide international protection and humanitarian assistance and durable solutions to refugees. I was wondering how this mandate now translates really practically on the ground. Like, how do you support labor market integration of refugees, for example? Also, do you engage with businesses to promote access to the labor market?
Thank you very much, dear Gertrude. It's a great question, and it's really a great honor to be with all of you today. I work for the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, as Gertrude has stated, and we have around 11.3 million forcibly displaced people in our part of the world. I cover the region of 43 countries that start from Kazakhstan down under to the Pacific Islands, actually. And we have more than half of the world's actually stateless population here. We also have 10% of the world's total forcibly displaced. And accordingly, we also have around 19% of refugees under UNHCR's mandate globally. So globally, UNHCR, and also in this part of the world regionally, we have a lot of responsibility. As you have stated, first and foremost, of course, our core mandate is related to protection. So what we would like to do is to ensure that refugees can access their rights. So we come up with our tents, with water, with registration, with cash, with assistance, the moment that a crisis starts. We always are very proud to say UNHCR is the first one to arrive and the last one to leave as well. But of course, we see that the humanitarian approach is not solely sufficient anymore, because we need a systemic approach where more opportunities are created for everyone, actually. So we need to be contributing to the sustainable development of the countries rather than focus only on the forcibly displaced, because that's also always the discourse that we hear from the host communities, from the host countries as well, that they're also struggling with their own challenges, which is also, of course, a very, very valid argument, because most of the refugees are being hosted in developing countries. Therefore, what we try to focus on is to bridge the two worlds. We would like to really make sure that we are not working in silos, but we are working together in order to create more opportunities and solutions for refugees and, of course, the other forcibly displaced. Because when we talk about the forcibly displaced, we're not only talking about the refugees, we're talking about the internally displaced persons, we're talking about the returnees, and we're talking about the stateless as well. So what do we mean when we talk about solutions? Of course, in an ideal world, we would love to see that the conditions improve and everybody can go back to their countries, so voluntarily, of course, doing so. And the second solution is that they are resettled to a third country, and also with labor mobility, we collaborate very much with Talent Beyond Boundaries as well. And we are also very much grateful to the countries that host refugees, because Bangladesh is one of them. So we are grateful to the government of Bangladesh as well. And of course, the third one is then inclusion. We are aware of the resettlement numbers. They're not really sufficient. Therefore, inclusion becomes more and more important. Why do we talk about inclusion? Of course, people come to the countries with their talents, just like you were stating, Rachel, with their diplomas, with their experience, with their expertise. And even if they don't have any of these, they come with the determination to really rebuild their lives. And whenever we speak with the forcibly displaced, that's what they always state. Because of course, aid is always time dependent, fund dependent, but we would like them to be really self-reliant. And that is why my title is Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Officer. So we envision an ideal economy where everybody is included and everybody can access the good opportunities. We have two big milestones related to this. One of them is in 2016, the New York Declaration, and in 2018, the Global Compact on Refugees, where there has been over 100 pledges from governments and the private sector related to jobs and livelihoods opportunities. And in this case, it takes even more than a village. We need the whole of society to collaborate, because this is a challenge that we need to, of course, tackle collaboratively. We need the United Nations agencies to collaborate with us. We need the private sector. We need the governments. We need the non-governmental organizations as well, because we cannot do it together, of course. So for us, economic inclusion means that people that are forcibly displaced can access the opportunities and can become socioeconomically contributing members of any society during the time that they are there, because we know that they can become exporters, inventors, innovators, employers, employees, taxpayers, if they can access the right opportunities. And it means that they can actually contribute to the sustainable development of that country. And for me, I will answer more in the second round related to our collaboration with the private sector, but especially on livelihoods and economic inclusion, it is impossible to do our work without the private sector, because private sector is the one that, of course, creates the employment opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Damla, especially also for highlighting that, we shouldn't only focus on the displaced persons, but also look at the host communities, the host countries who often already have their own challenges, and how can we bridge these two worlds. We need a whole of society approach to make this work, and the private sector has an important role in that. So I think that's a good lead way to actually hear from Sung In from Adidas, because Adidas has been very committed to improving the protection of migrant workers and displaced persons in the supply chains. We've been happy as IOM to be part of that journey, also through supporting, for example, the development of the migrant worker guidelines for Adidas supply chain. Now, I was wondering, from a business perspective and based on your company's experience, what type of vulnerable backgrounds do you see that some migrant workers are coming from? Because we see often also very mixed migration group. Maybe some people, have been forcibly displaced, others moved for economic reasons. So how do you see those vulnerabilities, and what is Adidas' approach to ensure respect of workers' rights in your supply chains, whether for migrants or displaced persons?
Thank you very much, Hertree. And I think, as you've noted, it's important to recognize the different types of migration that occur and the different drivers which cause displacement, whether that's forced displacement or voluntary migration for reasons related to socioeconomic opportunities and pursuit of decent work in other countries where perhaps a home country may not provide those opportunities. So of these different types of migration, labor migration, forced migration due to conflict or natural disasters, or even return, indeed, migration flows. Our supply chain and the work that Adidas has been doing to support decent work opportunities for displaced persons has focused on labor migrants and those who are migrating for socioeconomic reasons. So the focus of my comments today will primarily be on the work that we've done to support migrant workers in our supply chain. And indeed, labor migrants, and in fact, all displaced persons do face specific risks and challenges. I think in yesterday's final panel of the day on access to justice and for migrant workers, the IOM highlighted some key and quite sobering statistics. And as well, the recently published global estimates of modern slavery have highlighted that migrant workers are over 3 times more likely to be in situations of forced labor than non-migrant workers. That is a significant difference, which must be taken into account, and certainly something we've strived to take into account when it comes to respecting the human rights of migrant workers. And the report also continues that while we can recognize that labor migration has a largely net positive effect on individuals, households, communities, societies, and indeed businesses, the finding of this kind of 3 times greater vulnerability demonstrates, the need for businesses, states, and other actors in this ecosystem to do more. Indeed, because of this vulnerability is driven by factors related to irregularly or poorly governed migration, so perhaps a state failure to protect, or indeed a business failure to respect when it comes to certain recruitment practices, and particularly managing unfair or unethical recruitment practices in the migration chain. And so as a business and in our commitment to the UNGPs, a key aspect of responsibly employing labor migrants for us has been to promote and really drive forward fair and ethical recruitment throughout our supply chain, and understanding the specific needs of migrant workers. And that's been initially through the provisions in our workplace standards, which is our code of conduct for suppliers, as well as our employment guidelines, which we share with all of our suppliers regarding core fundamental human rights, including those of migrant workers. And through these initial policies and practices, we've attempted to embed protection of migrant workers in all of our operations and our supply chain. As Gertrude has mentioned, we've also partnered with the IOM over the past several years to expand and cascade our commitment to zero fees. First of all, by developing a no recruitment commitment, following on our commitment to the FLA no fee policy, and as well as building capacity across our supplier base to support responsible recruitment and employment of migrant workers. We've also made an effort to really integrate and include migrant workers in all of our employment processes, including providing our worker surveys and access to grievance mechanisms in their native languages. So I think yesterday in the panel, it was highlighted that there are certain just basic gaps, including access to materials and information and support in native languages that's not being provided in certain cases. And certainly, while we have room for improvement, we've done our best to provide information and access to information about rights to migrant workers throughout our supply chain. In addition to the work that we have done to responsibly recruit and employ migrant workers, I would like to mention that we have launched some programs to provide meaningful employment opportunities to those who are displaced by conflict and refugees. Our initiatives have included I apologize that these examples are not from the Asia Pacific region, but are examples of how we've included refugees into the formal labor market has included a program and employment pathway for Syrian refugees in Turkey, and a global partnership with the organization Tent Partnership for Refugees, based in our headquarters in Germany, to provide mentoring, training, and employment opportunities to refugees and migrants in Europe. I, again, apologize that these are not examples from the Asia Pacific region, but these both highlight the importance of businesses engaging with the full ecosystem of actors to support decent work for migrant workers, including governments, international organizations, a civil society, and workers, to be able to provide refugees meaningful integration and employment and protect their rights. So with the example in Turkey in 2016, we petitioned the Turkish government to change the labor law to permit temporary work for Syrian refugees. And we did so in collaboration with the UNHCR, and I know Damla played a large role in that initiative. These initiatives, both in Turkey and in our headquarters in Germany regarding refugees, have been focused and localized, but believe that we have the potential to replicate or scale such programs with the right partners. And so perhaps I'll wrap up my initial comments, and I apologize, Gertrude, perhaps I'm running over time, that the value of partnerships is really critical to decent work opportunities and strengthening a global program to respect the rights of migrant workers and ensure that no worker pays for a job and can access decent work with dignity. So while we've made much progress so far, I know that with the right partners, we can be doing much more. And yes, with that, I will close.
Thank you, Sung In. Indeed, very, very good examples. Also, you know, even though they're not from the region, I think what you said is right. How can we scale some of this good practice? And it does show that, you know, businesses can play a very important role in you know, looking how we can provide better and decent work opportunities to displaced persons. But I think also the commitment you mentioned overall to ensure, you know, a code of conduct for suppliers, commitment to zero fees, responsible recruitment for migrants and displaced persons, regardless of, you know, the reasons for their migration. I think this is very commendable. And perhaps also to reflect on what you said, that one of the main challenges is that this migration is not well managed, that eventually people, you know, migrate irregularly, and this, you know, leads to greater vulnerability. And I think that reflects also what you said, Rachel, that even for displaced persons, it might even be more difficult to understand, you know, what are the legal pathways available to them to find employment. I think it's time now to hear the employer's perspective, because we also have Farouk with us from the Bangladesh Employers Federation. So I wanted to ask you, what's the employer's point of view? What kind of initiatives do you think could be created to provide fair, equal, and decent work for displaced persons? What are some of the initiatives you're aware of? And of course, indeed, Bangladesh is a very interesting example for that.
Sorry. Thank you. Good morning, friends and colleagues and esteemed participants. I feel encouraged that in most of the, or many of the seminars or discussions that we see normally, it's usually a male-heavy panel. But this time it's a female-heavy panel. And I must admit that my experience, whenever it's a female-led initiative, the success rate is much more than that of male-led initiatives. Congratulations, my panel members. Distinguished participants, I would like to express my sincere thanks to IOM and ILO for organizing these very timely discussions. Coming down to the particularly to the displacement issue, as of now, millions of people are displaced worldwide, and it's a huge number that, as a responsible global citizen, we just cannot remain silent. It also seriously contradicts the main theme of the SDG, no one to leave behind, and which means taking explicit actions to end extreme poverty, curb inequalities, confront discrimination, and fast-track progress for the farthest behind. The displaced persons are all-encompassing victims of poverty, inequality, discriminations, and all types of social deprivation. Not only as an employer, but also as a responsible citizens of this global village, we must work together hand in hand by all stakeholders, be it organizationally or individually, to minimize the displacement due to oppression or repression because of social, economic, political, cultural, or natural calamity. Out of millions of displaced persons worldwide today, almost 99% of them are mostly, in case of international displacement, are due to political conflicts among the states, for which the common citizens are at no fault of their own. They are complete victims of the external tyrannic circumstances. As an employer and as all other sensible stakeholders, we must have some responsibilities on this particular issue. First of all, the displaced person should be offered with education, training, skills development facilities so that they can be part of the economic activities. There should be economic empowerment activities, and these activities should be connected to the needs of the local demand so that they have an easy space to make themselves as comfortable as possible in terms of life and livelihood. They cannot be also kept in isolation for usual living amenities and facilities like freely undertaking religious rituals, access to use of technologies, medical services, children's education, upskilling, reskilling, access to some kind of finance to make special arrangement particularly for them. Bangladesh is hosting for about 1.2 million displaced people. As already my previous speakers have mentioned, the local and host community has also some conflicting challenges. But in order to minimize the efforts, there should be some innovative and comprehensive ways of moving forward through a partnership, through a collaborative approach. And some of the lower echelon activities of the supply chain, like for example, some sort of skills development activities, like for example, some handwork, woodwork, or similar sort of micro activities should be placed within their communities so that they can also uplift themselves and they can also be linked to the overall supply chain in that locality, if not internationally. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your views. And indeed, as you said, Bangladesh is hosting a large number of displaced persons. And it's important to look at what are some of the innovative solutions we can find, also taking into account that the challenges the host community is already facing overall, and starting from the local level, the skills development, the local supply chains, to perhaps, the bigger international solutions. So I think this is a great start for us to look at, what can be done, and perhaps, to ask a similar question now back to Rachel from Talent Beyond Boundaries, because you also work to directly support displaced people through special programs for displaced talent. And we know that recently some countries like Australia have launched a specific displaced talent visa programs to allow those to get out perhaps of their first host country to go to a country like Australia. And as you said, it's very difficult for displaced persons in the first place to understand, would there be a job opportunity for me in Australia? How do I even get there, right? So I was wondering, what's your experience with supporting these displaced talent visa programs like in Australia? And do you think this could be part of the solution?
Yes, I do. TBB has negotiated special visa programs in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and there are other countries coming online this year. What we find is that we actually can't keep up with the demand. We're a small startup organization, really a pioneer in the area of labor mobility. And once sort of the genie was out of the bottle, there was no stopping it. So we see enormous demand from other countries to get involved with this solution. Just to provide some additional context, TBB was founded as a response to the Syrian refugee crisis. And it proved very successful with Syrians in Jordan and Lebanon. We've expanded to reach a lot of Palestinians, a lot of Iraqis, and quite a few Afghans as well. Because we're a startup, we focused very much on developing proof of concept. This is a new idea that governments could open a specialized pathway for displaced talent, and the demand from employers would be there. So we were very focused on proving that the model could be effective. Now that we've done that, we're really interested in seeing how this could work in other parts of the world. So we've moved now to open a program in Asia that focuses on 4 countries: Malaysia, Pakistan, India, and Indonesia. The idea is that we can look for people who don't have other options, see if this is a viable solution for them in those countries, and offer them the opportunity also to move to these same destination countries if they're interested. The model very much prioritizes agency and choice at every stage. There's no compulsion to participate. There's no moment when you sign up and can't back out. This is simply an additional and complementary solution to those that are already on the table, because the need is so vast and the appetite from all stakeholders is so immense. We do see that.
Thank you, Rachel. And indeed, it's also clear that, particularly, let's say, the host countries within the region, like Bangladesh, they have immense numbers of displaced persons, while there are other countries like Australia who might perhaps be willing to receive some displaced persons, but the settlement opportunities are very limited. So this is where the thinking started on what are some other pathways we could offer to allow displaced persons more opportunities to access employment opportunities, in their host community or in other destination countries. So it's very good that TBB initiated this thinking and is working with governments like Australia to see how can we provide this opportunity. As you said, it's a choice, but there is clearly also demand for employers, persons who are displaced like any other people. They have talents, they have skills. So let's make most out of that. And how can we match those with opportunities in destination countries, whether Australia or others. So thanks for sharing that, Rachel. Maybe also to hear from the private sector, Adidas. So Sung In, your company has done a lot of efforts to promote the protection of migrant workers and displaced persons. You also highlighted this example in Turkey, where Adidas was actually engaged in advocacy to ensure that displaced persons can also have the right to work. This is really, really fundamental that private sector also contributes to this advocacy. So I was wondering what would be, let's say, your recommendations to your peers, to other companies in terms of what they can do to address, these situations for migrants and displaced persons, and how to better protect them also and offer them, decent work opportunities within, private sector and business supply chains.
I think in terms of key recommendations, I would highlight three based on our experience and certainly based on our partnership with the IOM in expanding our fair and ethical recruitment practices in our supply chain. So the first recommendation, I'll go into these in a bit more detail, but number one is to prioritize and focus. Number two, what I'll call 1 + 1 = 3. And finally, to embed, integrate, and include. So with regards to prioritization, we recognize that we have a large and complex global supply chain, and that alone as a business, we're not able to address all of the potential human rights risks and needs of workers everywhere in our supply chain all at once. And therefore, in terms of developing our own fair and ethical recruitment program, we focused first on identifying and prioritizing and then subsequently acting on the sort of risk hotspots where migrant workers in our supply chain may have been most vulnerable to forced labor or exploitation during the recruitment process. And we did so by focusing on geographies where we had the largest populations of migrant workers employed by our suppliers, as well as where we had identified gaps and where other perhaps businesses, organizations, industry initiatives were not already taking steps to address some of these issues. So in that, we conducted a global mapping exercise and decided to focus on our tier 2 suppliers in Taiwan for capacity building, as they employ migrant workers from several countries, including Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, and there were not existing mechanisms in our supply chain at that level to address the needs of migrants. The second recommendation, 1 + 1 = 3, really goes back to my previous comment about the value of collaboration and partnership. And certainly in our partnership with the IOM, we have gained the additional insight and expertise on migration issues and the ability to develop both a fair and ethical recruitment policy, guidelines, and indeed training and capacity building materials for our suppliers. And that included training over 100 tier 2 suppliers across Asia, as well as training over 40 labor recruitment representatives on ethical recruitment principles and our expectations. So collaboration, in my view, is really a key ingredient to ensuring the potential for scale and to address some of these common and shared challenges together. And then finally, to embed, integrate, and include, as we've, I think, spoken through the sessions yesterday, including affected stakeholders and affected rights holders in the conversation is a key component to the success of any program. And so we have done our best to integrate and include worker voice into the design and implementation of these programs, which are designed to support and protect migrant workers. And that's again through reaching migrant workers through surveys, through our grievance mechanisms, and through on-the-ground engagement and interviews with workers. And so through integrating their perspectives and also integrating the subject business practices so that, yes, while we're recognizing the specific needs of migrant workers, we're also building it into our business as usual approach. And with that, ensuring that all workers, and certainly migrant workers, are entitled to decent work and no one is in fact left behind.
Thank you for those recommendations from the business point of view, and particularly, the focus on capacity building, training also of suppliers. Perhaps as Adidas, as a global brand, you have more capacity, more bandwidth than the smaller, businesses or suppliers here in Asia. And it's good to hear also how we try to trickle that down to the suppliers, and also how to hear the workers' voice, the migrant voice, the refugee voice. It's indeed very important. Now, coming back to the employers and the perspective of the Bangladesh Employer Federation, Farouk, what would be your recommendation? So how can we accelerate transformative change for displaced persons, and what roles could employer federations play in that?
Thank you. First of all, as I already mentioned during my previous speech, that displacement, definitely we cannot, as an employer, we cannot remain silent. We have to cooperate and collaborate hands with all the other stakeholders, ensuring their basic rights. And in case of a visible transformation for their better life and livelihoods, we have to consider them as part of the society, as part of the human beings. So from that aspects, providing them with the basic necessities is a fundamental obligations on the part of anyone, be it organizationally from the government or from civil society, from the employers, from all communities from that aspects. And there should be a holistic approach, making a partnership to navigate a proper transformative change from that aspects, and partnership among countries, among regions, among societies, and all other stakeholders to minimize this dreadful situation of the displaced persons. As of today, the total global trade is something around $29 trillion. Even there could be an initiative by the global champions to create a separate fund for the displaced people. Even 0.1% makes about $280 million. Something like that. So in a couple of years' time, we could have a huge amount of fund to be utilized for the betterment and upliftment of the displaced persons. However, the displacement takes place because of no choice. These are all thrust upon. Say, for example, the displaced people from the Rakhine state of Myanmar, it was not their choice to come down to Bangladesh. Similarly, the recent incident, the Ukrainian people, they have gone to various other European countries. It was not their choice. They have been forced to leave their countries, otherwise their life is at a stake. So they are under such sort of dreadful situation where the partnership, the collaboration, the cooperation is the only way to move forward. And I must recognize the call made by the United States and also by Australia to take some of the displaced person of Myanmar from Bangladesh to United States and Australia. I would appreciate and aspire that all other capable developed countries also would come forward with similar approaches so that there could be a win-win partnership in moving forward from that aspect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great recommendations, and good to hear that employers cannot remain silent. I think we need the employers' voice and support in this debate to look for, the solutions for the displaced persons, which, as you said, maybe part of it can be a financial contribution from the private sector, a fund to support refugees, displaced persons, but also the win-win solution, which I think is what EBB is working on. How can other countries, whether US, Australia or others, maybe offer opportunities to some of the refugees who are in Bangladesh or other countries of first arrival. But this is something we have to work on. These are solutions we have to tailor, and indeed maybe also more advocacy towards other potential, countries of destination who could provide opportunities to displaced persons. So thank you so much for these recommendations, Farouk. My final question will be for you, Damla, for UNHCR, because of course also UNHCR, you already mentioned that, has worked in partnership with global and local businesses over the years. So I was wondering what you think is now the key in promoting the integration and decent work for refugees in global labor markets, and how best businesses could support this.
Thank you very much, Gertrude. Well, first and foremost, what Farooq has stated is really music to my ears. So I think I found my champion for our advocacy efforts in Bangladesh. I'll be very happy to follow up with you because, of course, we have two main situations in Asia and the Pacific. The very first one is Bangladesh and Myanmar, like you have stated, and also Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. So we are very happy to work with the private sector, as I've stated, and it's not really a want-to-have for us, but it's really a must-have for us. We need the support of the private sector, and of course, private sector, it has a lot of responsibility and has a lot of lobbying power, leverage vis-a-vis the governments, as well as their effect on the economies as well. So when we talk about the private sector, we don't only talk about the global brands with whom we collaborate very much, but their supply chains, the chambers, the trade unions, the associations, the confederations, and business associations, just like the Fair Labor Association that you have mentioned, who has been a great partner for us as well. Well, private sector, like I said, is crucial for any country. Of course, they pay the taxes, they create employment, they export, they innovate, they invent as well. Therefore, it is very important for us to be collaborating and have the support of the private sector. And we collaborate with them in many, many ways. The very first one is advocacy that we have been speaking about. And I was very lucky to witness the whole process in Turkey as well. I was very lucky to be part of that process, where the private sector really supported us in such a manner that when we organized the roundtables together with them, they said to the government, in case of the right to work, if you grant the right to work, we commit that we're going to hire them in our supply chain. And that wasn't really an empty promise, because there are labor market gaps in Turkey as well. Even though the unemployment rate is very high, the supply chain of the global brands needed skilled workers as well. Therefore, advocacy was something that we worked together with them. And in the end, in 2016, the 4 million refugees in Turkey have acquired the right to work. It's not a straightforward right to work. They first have to find employment, of course, but they can work formally, they have social protection, and they have rights as well. So that is really a breakthrough for all of us. And I would like to thank the private sector, of course, in person, because Sungbin is here as well with us. And Adidas has really been one of the pioneers. Fair Labor Association, Puma, Adidas, Nike, H&M, all the big brands have really supported us in making this happen. And another example that we have from the region is related to Myanmar, for example. When the violence started, the private sector again sent a letter to the government requesting them to stop the violence, otherwise they would have to stop the commercial activities. And they also kept the internet running, for example, which was a great example for us. And again, the right to work is not granted in this part of the world to many refugees. And you would think actually 11.3 million and 2.4 million is only refugees would not be a very big number. But unfortunately, it's not possible in our part of the world in many, many countries. Therefore, we try to advocate so that refugees can become socioeconomically contributing members of the society, as long as they're being hosted in, because we have also research related to the contribution that they make. And as I've stated, the private sector has really been pioneering together with us, accordingly also for the joint skills building programs as well. So we look at what sector is dominant in a particular country, who has skilled worker needs, and then accordingly we carry out joint skills building programs as well. Then facilitation of employment comes in. How do we do that? For example, when we collaborate with Adidas, they invite their supply chain and they say, we give our blessing to refugee employment in the supply chain. UNHCR is going to help you with the partners. They have skilled people. We either carry out the skills building program alone or together with the government, sometimes with the non-governmental organizations, and then we facilitate employment together. And then the third one, we have great examples related to this with H&M, with IKEA, with the global programs, and also, of course, with Fair Labor Association, with Adidas again. Then accordingly, the facilitation of employment leads to self-reliance. So they're not aid dependent anymore, and they can become consumers, they can become taxpayers as well. Then the last component that we work with the private sector is, of course, funds, because we are organizations that need funding to be able to to help the people we serve, and private sector also provides these fundings as well. H&M is a wonderful example. I'll wrap up in a second, because when I was leaving, I used to work for Middle East and North Africa and Turkey prior to this position. We were even carrying out awareness raising programs for the peer workers of the refugees and for their managers as well. Therefore, it is very important to keep in mind that the forcibly displaced population is a human capital. They have the skills. We have the Welcome Project in Italy, for example, where they can really become also managers in the companies that they work in. Therefore, of course, we need to support them jointly so that they can really contribute to the countries that they are in as taxpayers, employees, as employers, inventors, innovators. And of course, we cannot do this alone, and we need to do it together for the host community members of those particular countries as well. Therefore, we need to do it together, and we all need your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Damla. I think that's a very good message. We need to support from all stakeholders, whether it's civil society, whether it's private sector and government, of course. And I think it's very important how you highlighted that the private sector actually has a lot of lobbying power, and they can really support advocacy. For example, in terms of the right to work, which is unfortunately not yet granted to most refugees in this region. I think it's time now to hear from you, our participants in the room. I'm sure you also have reflections, ideas. I know there are also participants online. They're also welcome to post any questions. So I'll open the floor. I see a first hand in the back. I do want to ask you to be brief in your comment or question. Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, my name is Tomoya Obokata. I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery. Thank you for the insightful panel. I have two quick questions. First of all, many displaced people are fortunate to be in a safe third countries, but let's not forget that many are stuck in camps and settlements. So I just wanted to know, many of them are stuck there for a very long time. So I just wanted to know if there are any role the businesses can play to provide, access to decent work to these people stuck in that kind of environment. And second question is, okay, of all the displaced populations, asylum seekers are particularly vulnerable because of their legal status is uncertain. While their refugee determination is being, conducted, they can be stuck for some time. For example, in the UK, they don't have a right to work until 12 months after they filed a claim, and that happens a lot in Europe. So once again, I wanted to know if there are any good practices in terms of businesses assisting these people who are in that kind of irregular or uncertain situation. Thank you very much.
Very, very good question. Thank you. Indeed, unfortunately, many displaced persons are still stuck in refugee camps. How can they access decent work? What can the private sector do there? Who would like to respond to this? Yeah, right.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions. I'll answer first from the perspective of TBB, and then from the perspective of what I've heard from some of our partners. So TBB, actually, to your first point about people who've been stuck for a very long time in really difficult ongoing situations, that's exactly where we see that we can add value, because we are looking for groups that don't already have another solution in the region, frankly. You only want to put international movement, potentially to a global north country on the table if there isn't something viable nearby. And so we do a lot of outreach in those environments, in camps, in settlements, through partners, publicizing a database that we use to register displaced talent. We kind of think of it as LinkedIn for refugees. And so by all means, those populations are very much included in the TBB model. A question we sometimes hear is about remote work. This is not an area where TBB is active, but I do want to flag it because it's something that often comes up in these discussions. So more and more, especially in the post-COVID environment, companies are making it possible for workers to engage in either short-term or long-term work remotely. And that's often a very good solution, especially for people who are in limbo, as you've rightly identified. It could be an asylum seeker in the UK, it could be Ukrainians in Europe who have temporary protection aren't sure what the future holds, may or may not have the option to go back at some point, but aren't looking for that long-term move. So we've been excited to see employers offering that as an option in many cases. Again, it's not what TPB does, but in the interests of broadening this ecosystem so that there are more options on the table for more kinds of people, it's a great thing.
Thank you, Rachel. I think Farouk, you wanted to?
No, just a quick example what that we are trying to do in Bangladesh with the displaced person of Myanmar. The government has found out a better place for them for their accommodation. So government has constructed, with the support of other donor countries, government has constructed separate accommodations for them with the basic amenities of living, children's education, and some of the skills development program there. So there has been an ecosystem being tried to develop within their community so that they can have their day-to-day livelihood within themselves. Because of other certain sensitivity and political reasons, they have not been able to be merged with the local community, which requires a separate discussion or consideration maybe. So that's how we are trying our best, and lots of people are extending their hands in order to uplift their life and livelihood. Thank you.
Just to contribute to what my colleagues have stated as well, of course, ultimately, what we would like them to have is to go out and to be included in the society and work like everybody else and have formal employment opportunities. But as you know, we manage the camps, and that's a totally different, of course, huge component of UNHCR's work. And we do that together with the government of Bangladesh and with IOM also in some of the camps. So what we do is, in case we need to, of course, operate within a parallel universe, then we create that parallel universe, because people need to be, of course, working to become productive, etc. So we have workshops inside where we really produce products that can be sold outside if the government allows, of course. Currently, we have a project with a very big global brand as well. We haven't declared it yet, so I'm not going to articulate the name, but it's really a global brand that is supporting us to, of course, advocate together and to improve those workshops so that we can simulate a regular factory environment, so that in case, hopefully, ultimately, if the right to work is granted, they can really go out and work. We have volunteering opportunities, we have cash for work opportunities. We would like them to become entrepreneurs as well, so we give them self-employment training together with some grants as well. And as Faruk has stated, we are working very extensively on Bashan Char, because of course they're allowed to work there and carry out commercial activities. I was there on mission for a long time, so we are coming up with opportunities even though they are in the camps, but ultimately, of course, for us, we would love them to be included in the society so that they can really contribute in the way that they can optimally do. Thank you.
Thank you. I think these are very good examples of what can be done even for those displaced persons who are still in the camps, and how also private sector employers, businesses can support. Any other questions from the room? Yes, in front here.
This is a question for Miss Adidas. Sorry, the name again.
Zoom in.
All right. Of course, we know that it's very difficult to be displaced, and nobody wants to go through that kind of experience, especially more difficult to regain a normal life. You mentioned earlier about the assessment of risk of employing them, but you did not say what kind of risk that you need to assess in order to employ them. Are you thinking of risk by the fact that you might be illegally employing them, which has a consequence to labor laws of the country or immigration laws of that particular country? Or is it risk about your company being able to be penetrated by possible terrorists? We don't know, but it could be a pathway, right? Or then it could be a risk to national security. So this is my first question, because you did not mention any of this risk. Second one, how do you balance normal recruitment process as against this displaced recruitment process? A lot of people will go through the process in their home country in order to go to another country to work. And also at the destination country of their employment, they have to, again, to go through a lot of legal process, documentary evidence and all that. And now here you are, you're skipping all that. So in order to employ these displaced people, so aren't you discriminating against those who go through the normal process? So as a company, where's your stand? I mean, it's not easy to get a working visa to go to America or even Europe. I mean, we all know that, right? But people go through that process. And then next thing, how do you strike the balance of your company's social responsibility as against the economic purpose of your existence? I don't know what benefit do you get from getting these displaced workers? Are you paying them less? I would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think part of the question is definitely for Adidas, but I would also ask Rachel to respond in terms of, creating these specific visas for displaced talents and what with the other people who are also struggling, to access legal pathways for labor migration. I did see 2 other hands, so perhaps we'll take those questions and then we give response, if that's okay. I believe you had a question. Yes.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. So when we are talking about the challenges, the first challenges is the identity issues of migrant workers or displaced persons. Can societies, governments, employers provide the identity to the employers or the workers? Is the first prime questions, and it is very difficult to provide access to medical assistance and schools without identity. So it is very difficult, and you know that recognitions of the society and recognitions with equal dignity to all people is also a kind of challenges, I would like to say. So another is the getting the social security packages is very difficult to the migrant workers or the displaced persons around the world. So I would like to say that is there any mechanism within the employers that oversight mechanisms? So they are maintain the whole human rights within the process, like that the equal payment, equal treatment, and all the things in the whole process. One question. So when you talk about the solutions, there is no doubt that multi-stakeholders should be engaged in the process, like governments, employers, private sectors, civil societies, even the villagers, the community. So I would like to say that UNHRC Nepal has a MOU with destinations countries like Qatar, Malaysia, that the national institutions can regularly monitor whether it is insured or not. So we can have such an experience that if not maintained the equal treatment, UNHRC and even the within the institutions, government agency can regular monitor and then provide justice to the victims who has not been treated equally. So I would like to say one more things that how about the undocumented migrant workers? We are talking about the documented migrant workers, very, very challenges that undocumented migrant workers faces. Are you equal to do you equally treat the undocumented migrant workers in your companies? Thank you.
Thank you for this question, which are 2 questions, one linked to the identity issues and a second one linked to equal treatment. I will take one more question from the floor before we give the answers. Yes, please. Yeah.
ขอใช้ล่ามนะครับ
Can I kindly ask you to be brief so we make sure our panel can still respond?
ครับผมเกรียงไกรชีช่วงนะครับเป็นเครือข่ายชนเผ่าพื้นเมืองแห่งประเทศไทยนะครับอยู่ภาคตะวันตกของประเทศไทยนะครับผมอยากจะได้ข้อมูลความชัดเจนเพิ่มเติมนิดหนึ่งเกี่ยวกับ แรงงานเนี่ยครอบคลุมธุรกิจเกษตรวิชนหรือว่าแรงงานเนี่ยครอบคลุมไปถึงกลุ่มเปราะบางกลุ่มชายขอบคนไร้บ้านต่างๆมากขนาดไหนนะครับเพราะว่าสิ่งที่มีวิทยากรด้านบนบอกว่าทุกคนเนี่ยสามารถมีศักยภาพมีความสามารถแล้วก็สามารถสร้างนวัตกรรมได้เหมือนกันเนี่ยผมก็คิดว่าพี่น้องเราซึ่งเป็นคนใช้ขอบเป็นคนเปราะบางตรงนี้ก็มีศักยภาพเหมือนกันอันนี้อยากจะขอความชัดเจนเหตุผลหนึ่งเพราะว่าพวกเราไม่ได้ย้ายถิ่นแต่พวกเราต้องการอยู่ที่เดิมแต่นโยบายรัฐที่ผ่านเรื่องของธุรกิจการท่องเที่ยวหรือเขื่อนหรือภาคช่วงชิงทรัพยากรเนี่ยไปมีเขาเรียกว่าไปมีพลังในการทำให้การเมืองหรือว่านโยบายรัฐเนี่ยไปช่วงชิงพื้นที่ของพี่น้องนะครับอย่างแกร่งกระจานเนี่ยตอนนี้ประกาศเป็นมรดกโลกแล้วเนี่ยพี่น้องไม่ต้องการย้ายถิ่นครับพี่น้องจะต้องการกลับไปที่ถิ่นแต่ตอนนี้จะถูกให้ย้ายไปอยู่ในคุกในเรือนจำนะครับอันนี้ก็คือประเด็นที่1นะครับส่วนที่2ก็คือว่าความเข้าใจเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของธุรกิจต่างๆที่เข้าไปเนี่ยภาพใหญ่เนี่ยครับธุรกิจเกษตรสิทธิมนุษยชนเนี่ยถ้าต้องการไม่ให้พวกเราใช้ทรัพยากรที่เอาไว้เพื่อโลกต่างๆเหล่านี้แล้วเศรษฐกิจหรือว่าความมั่นคงทางด้านรายได้ของเราอ่ะมันคืออะไรเพราะว่าเมื่อรัฐแย่งชิงไปรัฐก็ไม่ได้ให้อะไรกับพวกเราและพวกเราก็จะอยู่ไม่ได้อย่างเงี้ยครับใช้ทรัพยากรป่าไม้ได้น้อยลงใช้การดำเนินชีวิตก็ยากลำบากน้อยลงลูกหลานที่ไหลออกมาในเมืองเนี่ยก็ไม่มีความมั่นคงถ้าจะมีการท่องเที่ยวเข้าไปอยู่ใกล้กับชุมชนบ้างก็เบียดบางพื้นที่ให้เราไปเป็นแรงงานที่ราคาถูกแล้วก็ต้องไปอยู่ในภาคบริการที่มีความเสี่ยงในคุณภาพชีวิตอื่นๆอย่างเงี้ยครับอันเนี้ยก็อยากจะให้ช่วยถามแล้วก็พวกเราเองก็ไม่ถึงกับเป็นแรงงานที่ย้ายถิ่นแต่เราปักหลักในที่เดิมของเราแต่เราถูก
Can you
เข้าไปแย่ง
conclude
ชิ
your
ง
question? Otherwise, we cannot answer, I'm afraid.
ครับโอเคครับขอบคุณครับผม
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we have only 1 minute to give the answers to these 4 questions. I'll ask each of you to respond in 1 minute so we can end our session on time. I think, Sung-in, there was a question for you, if you would like to respond.
Yes, so I'm not sure I can address all of your points in the short amount of time, but I would like to respond to your point about risk, because Adidas for the past 20 years in building our human rights and labor rights program in our supply chain has focused on integrating the UN guiding principles and the principles of human rights due diligence, which defines risk as not risk to business, but risk to the people who are affected by our business and our operations, the risk to infringement on their human rights. And so when I speak about risk in my comments, and I apologize I didn't clarify this, I'm speaking not about the risk to us as a business, but what are the risks to the migrant workers in terms of seeking decent work, in terms of protecting them from exploitation and situations of forced labor. So really that's our view. And so in addressing the risks, we are looking to identify those areas where we might have the largest flows of migrant workers, and therefore where we would need to put better protection systems in place to make sure that workers are not at risk of having their fundamental human rights infringed upon. Secondly, just very quickly in terms of balance and the mix of employment contexts where we have both foreign migrant workers and local workers. Certainly when we did this global mapping of our footprint and the migration flows, we did look at those sectors and those countries where for a number of reasons, inherently the sector is largely dependent on foreign migrant workers. So this is, for example, garment manufacturing in Jordan, in Mauritius, certain sectors in Thailand, and then, as I've mentioned, our program focused on Taiwan. So in these contexts, our production and our suppliers' activities depend on foreign migrant workers, and that has been historically the basis for employment in those areas. And so it's not necessarily preferring our preferential treatment or employment of foreign migrant workers versus local, but it is just the nature of the sector in those geographies. And then I think it goes without saying that regardless of the context and regardless of the employee, whether it's a migrant worker or a locally employed worker, we have very clear standards of employment when it comes to non-discrimination, equal treatment, and basic protections of the kind of core ILO rights that have been outlined in the core conventions. So I believe I'll stop there as we're short on time.
Thank you, Sung-in. I also wanted to ask Rachel perhaps for a quick response on this question linked to, yes, dedicated visas or pathways for displaced talents, but what about the others who also have difficulties accessing, legal labor migration pathways and often move irregularly? Rachel, any reflection?
Yes, these are great questions. I just want to assure you that it's a normal recruitment process from the employer perspective. In fact, we tell employers not to make any special exceptions. Don't do this from a charitable perspective because it won't work. We say just consider this additional talent pool. Once you've done that, it's a completely normal HR process. In terms of who we work with, they have to be displaced across international borders already. So it's not an incentive to sign up for a program from your home. It's a solution for those who have already been displaced. It's not that the documentary requirements are waived, it's that there are alternative solutions. So if you don't have a passport, we work with embassies to facilitate one-time travel documents, for example. And I can assure you that that is just as arduous as getting a passport. It's simply that it's feasible for this population. As for what's in it for employers, everything. They are desperate for talent. We work with a lot of employers who are already recruiting internationally. So they're very accustomed to doing this because the domestic talent simply isn't there. I can tell you that countries the world over want software engineers. In Australia, if you're a dairy farmer, you will also get a job with no problems. There are all kinds of talent gaps, and employers are very, very keen to identify those people who can fill them. They are required through our program to pay what we would call a ward wage, so there is no question of paying them less.
Thank you for responding on that, as well as on the equal treatment, equal payment. I will ask Damla to maybe clarify on this question linked to identity issues, and then we'll go to Farouk for the final response.
Let me respond to your question related to the identity. Well, first and foremost, of course, being a migrant and a refugee are totally different legal statuses for us. Therefore, it's very important to understand what the legal status of that person is, because a migrant has a choice usually for us, of course, because of various reasons which we acknowledge. But for us, we have to have founded fear, and they need to be really escaping from war. They need to be forcibly displaced according to the standards that we have. And there's the big 1951 convention, where states are either signatory or preparatory parties to the convention, and then there are the local laws as well, so the national legislation. Well, the first step is, of course, registration with us, be it the umbrella law like temporary regulation in Turkey, because there was an influx of 4 million people where they can fall under that umbrella, and then registration takes place by the government. Or it can be individual assessment of the asylum, where we really determine whether that person is entitled to asylum. That's another procedure as well. Therefore, the first step for us is to have them registered. It can be either an identity card issued by UNHCR together with the government, by UNHCR alone, acknowledged by the government, or by the government itself. Therefore, of course, in order to access services, this is the very first step. And we always work together with the government to facilitate this. And registration is the first step, related to social protection as well. When they have, of course, these rights and the ability, the registration, the status determined, then the ultimate objective for us is to make sure that they can work in a decent manner, access formal employment opportunities, and to also access social protection. And related to the colleague who was talking about their own issues, the internally displaced, stateless, whatever the status is, I'm sure our colleagues are doing their best to address those as well if they're acknowledged. Thank you.
Thank you, Damla. So I'll now invite Farouk for the final response.
Thank you. I'll just take 1 minute. In regards to Madam's question, Madam, it's a huge challenge for a government when the displaced community upsets the local community. Say like we have 1.2 million displaced persons from Myanmar. The local community is less than 500,000. So it's a huge challenge for a sitting government to take a proper decision from that aspect. So I don't explain further. Sir, in terms of what already Dimla explained, there are theme differences between migration and displacement. Of course, I understand that the undocumented migrant workers also should enjoy the rights and privileges, but then definitely there are things to be done for them, but then the reality is something different, which you already know. In terms of registration, yes, it is done. In all cases, some records are being kept in. Sir, in terms of your question, particularly indigenous community, definitely I do endorse whatever that you have made, but there are other international tools, norms, and conventions working on that. I think definitely the local government or as well as the international community has a role to play in that. But then we are sorry that you have mentioned about the ground situation. Thank you so much to everyone.
No, it is me to thank all the panelists. It was an excellent discussion, and of course to thank the participants for listening, for participating, for sharing your views. It was really a pleasure to be here with you today. I think we'll have a coffee break now, and then we'll reconvene for the next session. Thank you very much.